Prime Minister, whenever you're ready. Here, here.
Hi, I'll take POIs in chat, please. Two pieces of setup and then a few points in this debate. Firstly, what does it mean to be deemed a war criminal? I think this looks like, for example, being locked up in prison, being barred from future positions of power, and seeing appropriate financial punishments as seen fit. But secondly, I think there's still going to be reasonable criteria of justice that would still apply. So you still have to do things like prove intent. So you're not accidentally inciting violence. You have to prove a degree of like active intent to want to justify the colonial regime. And similarly, also like degrees of punishment and complicity that we already recognize within the criminal justice system. So for example, like we maybe have harsher punishments for large and influential artists that have caused a greater degree of harm, and also just things like tracking direct culpability. So like maybe in the aftermath of releasing a specific study, you can see how this ties specifically to a policy that was immediately passed afterwards. You can track the culpability in this way and punish based on the degree of culpability and the extent of harm that occurs from these actions. But that being said, there's two reasons as to why this is important. First, it is principally obligatory that we pursue this punishment and deem these people war criminals, which is what exactly they are. So there's two main burdens of this argument. First, why are you sufficiently culpable in terms of actually creating harm? I think this is it's because your art is often, or your research as intellectuals is often directly used by people in power to, for example, justify their own policies. So for example, local or state governments often do things like outsource research to how to pass policies and then justify and package those policies to researchers and academics within universities, and fund these intellectuals and communities to do this research as a means of actually weaponizing it as a tool to justify their own policies. And this is often important because it can give them a way out of, for example, showing their policies as good and morally just. But B, I think it also is uniquely important in terms of affecting and persuading people to rationalize the policies to themselves as well. And I think the reasons to why this is so uniquely effective is firstly, because academics often have a veneer of legitimacy. You're seen as having a monopoly on truth if you're from a university or a scholar with a fancy degree. You're seen as having the skill and the expertise and the qualifications to speak on the truth of society, and people see your words as being the most educated and therefore the most accurate. So they believe your words uniquely. But secondly, you offer them a method of self-rationalization as well, where oftentimes people are caught in a dilemma between self-interest and wanting resources from colonial plunder, but also guilt. When you see the faces of people that lose their families and the sorrow and the suffering they feel from losing their culture, you feel a mixture of between these two worlds. Whereas on the comparative, in the absence of having a way out, you often feel the guilt more from seeing the visceral suffering before your eyes as someone who is engaging in colonial plunder. But now you give them a way out. You say this is, for example, like the mandate of heaven to, for example, give these people a way to access God by re-educating them. When you give them a way of rationalizing their own guilt, which means you uniquely justify and empower colonial regimes as well. But thirdly, on the note of art, I suggest art is often uniquely emotionally compelling as well, where you can do things like use imagery, use music, or visuals in a way that is emotionally evocative to portray, for example, colonizers as holy men, or paint pictures of indigenous people suffering in their primitive state. So you can also use this avenue to combat the otherwise emotional guilt you would feel by giving you positive emotions about the actions you're doing to combat the counterfactual guilt that exists more on our side of the house. This uniquely proves that we legitimize the regime in terms of, for example, like justifying policies that otherwise would get some more backlash because of the empathy that people would otherwise feel. But secondly, you just like directly are complicit for small everyday day-to-day actions. When you believe that someone is inferior and lower than you, you're more willing to do things like, for example, like take them into a re-education camp, or to harm them, or to brutalize them because you see them as less than human. You're also responsible for individual instances of harm for people to internalize this messaging and internalize the art itself. This proves that you have some degree of culpability. Why is a complicity in causing harm a sufficient bar to justify being deemed a war criminal? This is the second burden. And look, now that we've already proven that you are directly have some causal link to causing harm, I would suggest this is important because because it shows that without your actions, this harm would not have existed. And I think this action is a form of like moral culpability in and of itself. There's no like action in action distinction because people individually are responsible as moral agents. But this is important because, for example, like the generals that ordered the rape of Nanking may not have directly participated in these specific actions of brutality, but they were complicit and directly a cause of the actions that had happened. We think this is similar for people who are artists or intellectuals because they have significant power over society that we've proven to you with the previous mechanisms. But the final thing I want to do then is to show why these people are often more culpable than the people who actually engage in these actions. And this isn't a necessary burden for a case. Insofar we've already shown they're sufficiently culpable, it is morally obligatory to prosecute them. Insofar as, for example, like, victims need justice, they have done harm, and the justice system needs to punish them in order to exact vengeance for the victims of their crimes. But also, I want to show that even if there is a trade-off, I want to prove they're more culpable, and this trade-off is morally worthy. Before that, closing first, if there's one.
Do you think reprisals are good for a post-colonial state?
So I think there's a question between what is good and what is just. We're going to weigh why justice is most important, and then we'll talk about some practical impacts after. But why are you often more culpable? So I think the reason you're often more culpable than, for example, individual soldiers or people that like worked within re-education camps or work to extract resources, is that you're often more wealthy and privileged to be an intellectual, to do things like have access to university education, to allow you to be an intellectual in the first place, or the financial stability to become an artist that often isn't profitable. What is the implication of this? You have significantly more opt-out mechanisms towards engaging in plunder. It's the fact that you have access to knowledge, to information, and the skills to process and rationalize the consequences of the actions that you have on the world and society on a more broad and macro level. So you had a greater capacity to know it was wrong. So it is more likely that you actually chose to engage in wrongdoing as opposed to genuinely believing that what you're doing was right, but it means you have a greater degree of culpability. But secondly, you have a more financial opt-out system. You have the capacity to not accept the funding of the local government because your family is likely rich in the first place. You can do things like have disposable income to fall back on, to for example, not engage in what the government would like, and to pursue a lower paying job that isn't relevant to, for example, politics. This means that you have a greater degree of culpability because it proves that it was a moral choice. Second point, why do these people have bad political power in a society, and why is it practically good to remove them? And I think the characterization about why these people are wealthy is important because it means that you are often the elites. You had elite education, which crucially means you have ties to politicians and military generals or CEOs with lobbying power that also graduated from these elite universities as well. And the reason this is important is that in the aftermath of colonialism, a post-conflict society is still divided, but there's still some supporters of the regime within society as well. This is problematic because it allows these former intellectuals to form opposition parties that maybe might take softer stances and rhetorics after the colonizers have left, but they still have significant sway because of, again, the unique veneer of legitimacy they have means they have unique degrees of support compared to the counterfactual people that could potentially replace them. But B, they hold important bureaucratic positions that they can maintain through political lobbying because they're ties to CEOs, which means they can block good reform policies and maintain some past colonial structures by embedding them within technocratic positions within bureaucracy. But three, they can also continue to incite instability when they still subtly do things like pass art with like dog whistles, or pass, like, for example, or write research with like dog whistles to still enable past regimes as well, which means that they can still continue to incite violence and instability within people with the emotional power of their art and their intellectual creations. But the counterfactuals that you get less backlash, because even if you get, for example, some martyrdom by locking these people up, you actually have a public trial. It means there's a larger perception of justice, but it is also less sustained because even if you have some backlash, it goes away in the long term. But if you allow the people to continue staying in society, they can indefinitely cause harm into the future. For all these reasons, propose.
Thanks for the nice speech. Calling in the leader of opposition to begin their case. Here.
Amazing. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. Before I begin, I don't normally do this, but since this is recorded, I'd just like to clarify. As both a colonized person as well as a white guy living in East Asia now, the things I say in this round do not necessarily reflect my true beliefs. Colonialism is complicated. In a debate speech, you have to be a little bit reductive, more reductive than normally I like to be about this topic. With that said, just want that for the record. Let's move into the speech. I have two big issues with opening government. The first is I think they ironically take a very complicated topic and reduce it to evil colonizers and the plucky good resistors to the colonizers, when generally in colonized regions things were a little bit more complicated before the colonizers arrived. And second of all, there's an intent mismatch that the prime minister tries to smuggle into this claim, right? And this is quite clever to try and do, but I'm not going to let them get away with it. making art about events that are currently going on, even art that might express some support or some sort of complicated feelings into this idea, just does not mean you support the murder of innocents, right? This is a very individual act. Art often expresses grand ideas about political narratives, right? Similarly, if you are exploring the intellectual validity of ideas like racial science or the cultural supremacy, these kinds of ideas like this sort of like Darwinism applied to cultures, which was one of the prominent things that fell out of Darwin's theory of evolution, and one of the ideas that then generated to support colonialism. Exploring these ideas does not mean you support actions of direct harming to individuals. This is not something that's ever linked in the Prime Minister's case. And I think they try and confuse this relationship because it's a very hard link to make. It's one I'd like to hear Deputy Prime Minister defend. Let's set up this round very simply because we're talking about war criminals here. To be very clear, not normally the kinds of things that have a public trial unless it's through the ICC. Generally, domestic war criminals are tried in military courts, which are not the normal justice systems of most institutions. They are closed. They have incredibly poor defense. Like, it's very hard. Almost everybody who gets convicted at closed military court tribunals is convicted successfully, and the punishments are high, right? We're not talking about fines. War criminals generally are killed or jailed for a significant period of time. So I think the punishment is likely to be way higher than Prime Minister seems to suggest, and the conviction rate is likely to be unacceptably high, and a lot of reasonably innocent people will get punishments that either don't fit the crime or aren't warranted at all. In what instances might they not be warranted? This is our best case scenario. I'll establish this first. So there are a lot of kinds of things that people pointed out who lived under colonial rules that were reasonable to defend. Right. So, for instance, when Britain colonized India, they banned the practice of bride burning, which was when a husband died, they would burn their widow alive to like have them ascend to the afterlife or something. Britain came in and outlawed this. I think that was just objectively good for them to do. Right. A lot of people defended the British rule because the previous sort of rulers, right, under the caste system in India were quite oppressive to individuals. When the Spanish arrived and the Aztecs, other indigenous groups helped the Spanish fight against the Aztecs. And a lot of the conception was that these people arrived from overseas to sort of save them because the Aztecs were so fucking horrible of rulers that everybody hated them, right? They didn't know that the Spanish were ultimately as malicious, probably not as bad as the Aztecs, to be honest with you, but still quite bad. But at the time, right, this is how these ideas come apart because there was legitimately conflict there. And a lot of the colonizers brought in ideas that were reasonably correct, right? Like being a little bit nicer to women or certain aspects of human rights and constitutions and democratic norms, which wound up being imposed in a lot of these places by colonizers, but that I think are motives in the abstract that are good. So point is here, a lot of the kinds of claims as a result of the mechanism of overcapture I explained through military courts and why things are likely to be overly prescribed, lots of these kinds of people who have reasonable claims probably get policed in ways that are unacceptable. Last sort of example here is a lot of people argue about collaboration just because it was better than trying to fight a losing fight. So I think there's also motives there and a lot of sort of art and sort of intellectuals who were just saying, hey, don't fight, it's not worth it. You know, sure, we'll be colonized, but it's better than dying in a war or something. Those kinds of motives happen too. Why would governments want to do this? Because lots of regimes claim post-colonial legitimacy that is kind of nebulous, right? The BJP do this, but it's not clear that the Hindu supremacist BJP are any legitimate of a power for a lot of minorities in India than the British supremacist British colonizers, right? So there's clear incentives by governments and the structure of the courts which implement this policy from an analysis motion perspective to overcapture a lot of people who might have reasonable things to say. I think this is our best case. Obviously, these instances are horrifically unjust. Government needs to contend with this. I don't think they've clearly set up enough of a scope of the scale of harm to justify these reasonable, innocent people being punished or possibly even killed. But second of all, let's focus on the worst case. I think first of all, this motion is somewhat antithetical to the general prospect of like ideas and freedom of speech and coming to sort of a cumulative understanding about the world, right? So in order for us to learn, you have to be able to freely express ideas you think might be true and better able to become to the truth collectively, right? Like a lot of people hate Peter Singer for a lot of the things he says about disability activism, and a lot of the things he says about animal rights and stuff. He's quite a controversial figure, but I think the world is better when people like him can express things they think might be plausibly true, but are very controversial, right? I don't think that a precedent of punishing academics, right, it creates a chilling effect upon whether or not people are willing to speak against the grain in this country, particularly to criticize the government who claims a degree of post-colonial legitimacy that, again, might not even be fair. I think people should be able to say perhaps certain things the colonizers said happen. And this is perceptual, right? Because even if opening government wants to respond and say, well, we're not trying, we don't think it's likely that those people get affected, I think a lot of academics now think twice about whether or not they can say certain ideas that they might believe in. And this stifles the ability of that country and that culture to explore ideas and come to a better collective understanding. Lastly, I think it is unreasonable to impose crimes on people who might not have really had another opportunity, right? Because if you think of yourself as a person from their perspective at the time, right, you see a culture with significantly higher technological superiority, successfully conquering the world. I think to a lot of people there, when you hear ideas from other prominent academics from your community and elsewhere, from a lot of people who are legitimately the experts in the field, who say, yes, this like cultural superiority, this cultural Darwinism concept is correct, you reasonably are like, I think if you just think about it, it is easy to understand why a lot of people came to these conclusions. And so I don't know that you necessarily have the moral capability of coming to a different conclusion. And obviously, if you don't choose to do something, it is morally repugnant to punish you for it.
Thank you for the very nice speech. Calling in the Deputy Prime Minister to start this case. Here.
Hello. POIs ideally by just like turning on your camera and waving at me, but if not, like if I'm at like 5:45, you're waving and I don't say anything, feel free to interrupt and be like, hit me with the last chance or some shit. I don't really care about that.
Hi, sorry, I don't know if it's the same with anyone else, but I can faintly hear EPM.
Let me try to change my settings. Give me a sec. Is this better?
Yes, much better.
Okay, awesome sauce. Oh. 3, 2, 1. The first thing that I want to do in this speech is I want to be really clear about the sort of intellectuals we're likely to trial in these sorts of instances. Because I think what the image that OO wants to paint is look, Diggs is like, look, there are loads of intellectuals who perhaps are shackled by a lack of agency because of the opportunity for better options that are going to be affected by this. I want to be clear. A lot of these intellectuals have documented pathways of harm that exist when they opt into the colonial state, and I'll explain why right now. The first idea here is this, is that we think that these intellectuals are often in collaboration with colonial powers for 3 reasons. The first is on some level, they're bought out by colonial regimes. Loads of these local intellectuals are financially incentivized by colonial powers to produce these colonial narratives. They receive grants, they receive positions, they receive honors, they have the government literally asking them to do this. This probably tips you off on some level that you're causing some degree of harm or propaganda, at least in the form of intellectuality that you're beginning to pursue. So I think this is like probably one core reason why these intellectuals have some degree of knowledge of their actions. But the second thing here is that you oftentimes gain elevated social status. Liz tells you that you end up being recognized as a monopoly on knowledge, or that you end up being someone who has a helm on the way in which people understand and come to know information. And what this implies here is that you have social elevation that's directly linked by supporting the regime, which is a clear pathway, by the way, in which you are actively engaging in harm, actively denounce that you are engaging in harm, and probably on a third level, due to your status, can see the effects of this harm to people who are lower in the lower classes than you. But the third thing, and I think this is the bigger reason, is why these people and these intellectuals oftentimes get integrated into the colonial administrative apparatus, where they directly influence policy and education. They play roles in advisory councils, they play roles at university and cultural institutions, and they help propagate colonial identities. It doesn't look like they're just innocent guys who perhaps were thinking a little bit too hard in the university about what colonialism could do, but rather they are targeted actors who play a role in engaging and pushing forward the legitimization of this regime and benefit from it massively directly. We think this is a clear documented pathway to harm that probably implies that you have some degree of capacity to catch the right people in the most effective way, unlike what we got out of OO. But the second thing that I want to say here is this, is that oftentimes these people become instrumental in furtherly practicalizing the colonial regime because they look like now being able to engage in education systems. They're instrumental in shaping how education curricula emphasize the supposed benefits of colonialism. They are the people who now go to educational conferences, who set up schools and set up schools' curriculums, and essentially legitimize the regime further than just being a political apparatus, being one that implants furthest. But the second thing that I want to say in response to opposition, and I do think that this is something that you reasonably have to take into play, because yes, perhaps war crowds in our worst case are massively oppressive, are likely to result in great giga harm in all instances. We think that there are probably still degrees of scale, right? Someone who profits is now massively rich and wealthy off the case of promoting this probably faces a pretty harsher sentence as compared to someone who's expressing more general forms of art that are like not about necessarily poor things or glorification, but are about the regime or about colonialism themselves. They probably get lesser sentences. Perhaps these sentences in either world aren't great, but we think all of these actors, particularly the ones who have massive amounts of wealth that are and power and social power that are constituted because of the colonial regime, are the ones that necessarily go away. And for that reason alone, even if there are disparate impacts that are likely to result to some extent that are perhaps unjust, it's important to take these actors out of the helm. It's an important form of redress and justice that you otherwise don't get on their side of the house. The second claim, and this is a new extension that I want to push out, is to say that these intellectuals are just massive harms to these cultures. Yes, it's complex. It's not easy to dilute all of the complexities of colonial culture in like a 7-minute speech, but we can say a couple of pretty obvious things. The first thing is that there's massive amounts of psychological and colonial damage. That's to say that you propagate colonial ideologies and erode indigenous cultures. You marginalize these indigenous cultures and traditions by calling them backwards, by saying that they have no place in a modern world, that they don't know how to engage with the properness of the world writ large, and by promoting their languages and degrading their languages as ones from the back place. So they culturally displace and alienate indigenous peoples in massive amounts of lands. These are the people who now are oftentimes left behind in the process of colonization. But the second thing there is that these intellectuals will similarly in the same vein portray the Western culture and colonial rule as superior. And this psychological manipulation undermines the confidence and self-worth of not just the colonized, but entire massive populations and swabs of people, which in of itself is a pretty bad, massive harm. But the second mechanism is economic exploitation, and I'll take you in a second. But the idea here is this, is that by justifying these colonial presence, these intellectuals provide a veneer of legitimacy to exploitative economic policies. They endorse policies that facilitate the extraction of resources, the imposition of taxes, and the exploitation of labor. And note the first argument that I gave you in my speech and the first argument in Liz's speech. That's to say that these intellectuals, due to their ability to portray these things, due to their ability to give lectures and legitimize the regime, gain political power and sit on the boards that designate policy, so they play an active role then in legitimizing economic policy that looks like extraction of resources and imposition of taxes and exploitation of labor that benefits the colonial powers. And all of this ideology is oftentimes ones that support the wealth gaps in these regions and resources and creates massive amounts of wealth disparity that only serves to benefit colonizers and those that sit in the highest stratas of society. Thanks.
Yeah, I think very few people now seriously defend the actions of colonialism. So necessarily, you're probably punishing people who are no longer saying the kinds of things that they might have in the past. That seems pretty bad if these people have already changed their tune, are probably advocating things very similar to what you'd like them to in this sort of pragmatic argument here.
So, okay, but here's the thing. These are in people who will now either sit on massive amounts of wealth that they've gained off of the suffering of an entire nation, the entire nation who feels resentment, who feels inferior, who feels terrible about their livelihoods and their inability to achieve social climbing of the social strata because of the indigenous, because of these sorts of policies and economic things they pushed onto them. And now these people are just wealthy. They just fuck off and have massive amounts of wealth that they're able to sit on and have no degree of repercussion that's necessarily pushed onto them. For that reason, it's clearly principally justified to prosecute these people and face them at least with some degree of redress that you otherwise have no avenue of achieving on your side of the house. We think for all of those reasons, what OG has proven to you is clear. There are intellectuals who have played active roles in the colonization of these countries, who have played active roles in demeaning the livelihoods of people on the ground that have gone without consequences for far too long. If you support the indigenous peoples, if you support the ability for justice, you support OG. Proud to propose.
Thank you for the nice speech. Calling in the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their case. Here.
Hi, am I loud enough?
Yep.
Okay. We don't punish people for spreading their ideas, especially when the role is to come up with ideas. We're on the same page with government on punishing war criminals who actually harmed innocents, or generals whose role isn't to come up with ideas, but rather to take responsibility for their underlings. So we just don't want to conflate these ideas with the idea that academics and intellectuals whose job is to come up with ideas, allow these ideas to receive criticism, and perhaps the correct ideas to then be able to shine through within these instances. I don't think these types of punishments are going to be effective to any of the goals OG has forwarded in this round. Firstly, OG says you're sufficiently culpable because your research is directly used by those in power, because people believe your words, and because you offer people a mean of self-rationalization. These are all things that mean that you might have caused bad things to happen, but don't imply the important thing within which we actually consider or evaluate moral actions, because they never prove to us why you actually have moral choice. They just say, well, you might have been able to pick a different job. I don't think you're picking a different job is within the the intention of making a particularly different moral choice, right? Because you don't go into these types of positions holding beliefs that you would have held anyway, thinking I'm doing something that is immoral. These are often beliefs that Diggory explains in his speech are going to be beliefs that were pushed onto you, beliefs that you weren't able to opt out of, and therefore these are beliefs that surely are not a choice that you are making in these types of instances. First off, what is a guilty mind? You're an intellectual who is pursuing something. The goal of intellectualism is to look through ideas and have people be able to say things which is true to the best of their ability. So if they're wrong about things, then it's quite antithetical to to the purpose of academia to retroactively punish you for doing something. Like we figured out, maybe all of this stuff that we were previously trying to prove is wrong. This doesn't mean that all the things that they were previously doing to try and go through these types of proofs, to work through logic, to criticize other academics, all of those things were wrong, because that was necessary for actually discovering the truths, which we actually support in opposition. I'll take the point from Elizabeth.
The job of soldiers in colonial regimes is also to colonize, and also soldiers have even less opt-out mechanism and even less moral choice because they have less education to rationalize their way out of it and less financial capacity to opt out too. Should they not be war criminals?
No, you don't take soldiers as war criminals unless they did something that is war criminal worthy. These are completely different cases. If soldiers break the particular code, then yeah, they are war criminals. But when these soldiers are not doing those types of things, then they are not also war criminals. But also I think there's a fundamental fundamentally different line that you have to draw between the moral culpability of a soldier and of an intellectual. Because oftentimes, assuming these soldiers were able to opt out from being a soldier, they understand that even if there is not colonization that they're morally responsible for, it is still killing people. It is still oppressing a different regime that they are still responsible for. So there is still a significantly greater quantity of moral choice which soldiers are making compared to an intellectual who doesn't believe that their actions are directly harming people, who actually just believe that their actions are directly for the purpose of advancing their own society, etc. OG then says these intellectuals do have moral choice because they collaborate with colonizers or because they know they have like a monopoly of power or whatever like this. But I'm gonna flip this on Adam, right? If you're given a grant to make art, then this suggests your motive was to survive. And this seems okay. You might have been poor, and I think it's very reasonable for you to say, I'm going to take this grant from this foreign country to make art that, like, presumably doesn't actually end up being the tipping point on whether policy gets passed or not. And then, I don't know, use this, like, morally consequentialist type of system to say, this is actually an okay thing to do. It is a justified thing to do. I am not a morally unpraiseworthy person because I have done these things. Then OG says these sentences won't be bad. I don't think this particularly matters because punishing innocents in these cases are going to be bad anyway. OG then says these intellectuals are directly harmful, so therefore we should create deterrence. And they give some very reasonables as to why these types of sentiments are often going to harm the country. However, there's some important framing that is missing here. A government that is willing to jail these intellectuals on prop is equally likely to probably publicly criticize them on opposition. This is already good enough of deterrence from them from doing a lot of these types of things if they don't actually truly believe in them. Which is to say, I think that in a type of society where it is kind of possible to kind of criticize past actions, it is likely true that most of these past actions have already been filtered out as being bad. So if they continue to do this like pro-colonization type of stuff, then presumably they're still going to be criticized either by the public, by the government, or by somebody else in this society that clearly has sentiments that are anti-colonization. And then kind of the response to Diggory's POI goes, well, the people who benefited off of this are now just kind of wealthy. But this is just not the burden as to whether or not we punish somebody, right? People get rich off of dumb shit all the time. So think like really, really rich billionaires who obviously like even broke laws in order to get to the places they are. They might not be personally aware that they did these things. Perhaps it was their underlings who lied to them, but they are still rich to the extent that they probably also benefited off of the exploitation of other people. And I don't think that this is to any degree exclusive, like jailing all billionaires or whatever. But I don't think that this reaches the burden of proof to say that you should be jailed just because you were able to benefit off of certain things. Because you made a particular decision at a particular point in time that granted you some degree of capacity. These so long as the actions you took at the particular point in time were morally justified, then you shouldn't be criminally charged and punished in the future because you haven't actually broken the law. You haven't actually done something that is illegal. I'll take a point from CG before I go on. Okay, very cool. So in the end of the day, then, there are a few things we're able to buy out of this case. First off, when you criticize people when there's really no reason to criticize them, or specifically when you jail people who are particularly innocent when they're taking a particular action, then these people are going to continue to be punished in very ways that are very, very harmful. And you can say that this is maybe just, but I don't think that, or I don't know. I think what OG said is we don't care about the moral like correctness, but we care about like justice or whatever. I think that even if you defend moral justice, you shouldn't defend the punishment of innocence, because if you punish an innocent, the type of harm you inflict on somebody outweighs not harming a lot of people who might actually have deserved some punishment. So long as you kind of have like this very kind of sweeping policy where everybody who might have encroached on some particular thing and may have even advocated things that were good for their own society. So think like the Indians who perhaps criticized bride burning and all these things, like those people, when they're punished, then you impose a significantly greater moral harm as opposed to just having non-action on people who did not actually encroach any type of moral culpability in the first place. So if this is true, then we should prioritize protecting these innocents on our side of the house, even if they're lower in number. And also, I think that it is just also true that a lot of people are not in the conditions where they have the sufficient moral choice to say that they are like sufficiently guilty to be punished anyway. We're able to win on this principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very nice speech, calling in the member of opposition. Here.
Well, can everyone hear me?
Yes, clearly.
One second. Starting my speech. 5, 4, 3, 3, 2, 1. In a very unstable society that is a post-colonial state, that is a very new society with where there are a lot of institutions, it's not matured yet and other things like that, and everything is still quite unstable. The last thing you want is to introduce a policy of like more division, that's so simply more division and more policies of reprisals, right? I think that's why the opening house is kind of like out of this debate, because they never quite explain to you the context of where these particular trials are going to be happening, who these particular local intellectuals are, which particular groups of people within these colonial states they are coming from. And that's why CGSCO is going to come in here, prove to you why does it lead to like massive forms of instability, racial violence, and division within these particular states. And we think that even though we're talking maybe about value judgment motion and things like that, insofar as we can prove to you why, even if our government says it's justified to do this because of like some form of justice, I think like if we can prove that this leads to ultimately a disproportionate and unjustified amount of like harm to like people that is to like other stakeholders outside of these particular local intellectuals themselves, just the people generally who are living in these post-colonial states, I think we still win on this value judgment on like just pure pragmatic basis, right? So therefore, that's what we're going to introduce in my extension, right? Firstly, just on frame, right? How do these actual post-colonial colonial states look, right? Note that colonizers in a lot of these states simply use a lot of divide and conquer methods in order to like suppress and like control these populations, right? Which means that they arbitrarily, usually these particular colonial states are like home to like a lot of different tribes, communities, racial communities, other things like that. The way they term a lot of these colonizers like utilize like sort of like suppress these people is via like actually like arbitrarily elevating certain racial minorities in order to like use them, elevate them, and like use them as a control method and like use them as the like sort of like quasi rulers of these particular colonial states, right? This looks like the noble elites, like the Indian princes that they are being used by like the East India Company to like control the population. These look like Chinese and Arab merchants in Southeast Asia who are given preferential treatment in order to do this. This looks like the Tutsis and Rwandas and other things like that, right? Which means that this proves that for these particular racial communities, right, there's quite reasonable for them to necessarily like the rules of like the colonizers, because they generally gain a better, higher quality of life via these particular groups, right? Therefore, therefore, a lot of these particular local intellectuals and artists who necessarily support a lot of these colonizers comes from these separate like groups of racial minorities that have been given preferential treatment, who have seen their quality of life increase under these particular groups, right? Why do we think that it's still legitimate for them to actually still sort of support these groups, right? Firstly, one, it's quite arbitrary for them. It was quite arbitrary for them to like get elevated to begin with. They didn't choose to begin with it to like get like this preferential treatment, which means that they can, insofar as they're also legitimate and also focusing on like the well-being of like their own local communities, their families, and themselves and other things like that. I think they're quite legitimate to sort of like enjoy these things to begin with, these things as well, right? Insofar as they still focus on those things, right? Therefore, and also then going on further, what is it that these particular groups of people necessarily face in the current side once the post-colonial state happens, right? In these post-colonial societies, right? They face a lot of villainization and like sort of otherization, because they are sort of viewed by the majority group of people as like sort of already the tools of the colonizers, those who are supported the colonizers and other things like that. The tools of the colonizers who have propagated them, who have helped them like stay in power and other things like that. They're being seen as like enemies of the revolution and like the enemies of like independence. That's why you see a lot of racially targeted and racially motivated violence in like a lot of post-colonial states, because there's like a lot of racial tension from the like maybe a more oppressed majority groups against these particular minorities. Look at like, for instance, how the Hutu and Tutsi violence, and how like there's a lot of violence against Chinese people in like Southeast Asia once post-colonials once the country achieved independence, right? What the introduction of these particular crimes happens, right? No, I already explained to you why these intellectuals will just gonna disproportionately look like that they're gonna come from these groups, because they're generally the ones that are probably probably more benefited from these particular colonial rules. Therefore, the optics is just going to be that you're going to have a lot more of these particular intellectuals who are local leaders, scholars, and respected elders within these particular minority groups to be paraded as and like tried as like war criminals and things like that. And note, the frame is that there's already a vitriolic and villainization sort of like attitude towards these people from these members of these racial communities, right? Because they are viewed as like tools of the oppressors, which means that what Kiki just told you right now is completely untrue, that it's going to be fair and other things like that, because the public is going to demand blood when they're going through these trials, which means it's going to be far more repressive and far more vitriolic than it ought to be, right? What is the impact of the wider community is going to be, right? First, one, the people from these racial minority groups are going to feel even more targeted. They're already quite afraid that they're going to be like victims of like reprisals from these majority groups after like their independence is getting caused. And also note that a lot of these people, because of the beneficial treatment, also already holds a lot more capital and like all influence within these particular structures, right? A lot of capital that is necessary for like these particular countries to like sort of survive after after like independence in order to enter the world community, world economy, and other things like that. You're gonna influence a lot of more capital flight, and like sort of flight of like intellectuals and like people who could have probably been able to lend a hand in order to like sort of like help the structures, help like sort of stabilize the particular government and build up the structures that is necessary for you to actually build a functioning and stable government, right? Secondly, it just destabilizes and promotes significantly more harms against these groups, people who are not these local intellectuals, not these particular artists, to like not these artists, who are to like promote more harm and racial tensions against these people as well. The moment that you have the parade like their local leaders as war criminals, brand them as war criminals, and imprisoning them for like a significantly long amount of time. Why therefore do we think that what you call alternative is probably far better, where you probably encourage and promote more reconciliation over reprisals that like government is trying to do? I think our opening opposition already explained to you like probably why these particular people are like via like colonization is quite bad right now. Why these particular people are probably going to be anti-colonialization to begin with now, which means, and since they're still in a particular country, there's that incentive for these local intellectuals to sort of help you actually stabilize and like actually help the particular government to like survive, right? Which means that the comparative is that these particular people can then like launch stabilization, like have these particular local leaders talk to their local community to have more reconciliation and like sort of show up form of like cooperation in this racially divisive and racially tense particular states in order to like actually move forward a path together. Finally, on just like principles, why we think it's just unjustifiable to do this. I think like academic freedom is just important, right? The downward impact of this, which opening opposition never infringe, is that the moment that you do this, you infringe on academic and artistic freedom, which means you send a signal that basically the freedom that like artistic and academic research can simply be like sort of be like punished as like war crimes and other things, and like such heinous crimes, right? Which is just an easy pathway to like dictatorships and other bad things. For those reasons, opposed.
In the op whip to end the case. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll take POIs to chat. And yeah, just a heads up that what I'm saying does not represent, my views. Panel, for the government bench to cross the benchmark for this action to be a crime, I say this is legally a high burden to fulfill. The question to ask to clean up the opening is, are local intellectuals legally blameworthy for the actions that they take? If so, then they should be punished. Panel, just because something is bad, unfortunate, it does not mean something is legally blameworthy. This is a value judgment debate. Only if these actions are legally blameworthy can government bench subsequently prove the legitimacy of the debate. From CO, we agree with OO on the fundamental clash of this debate. Sure, colonialism and the collaterals of its product is often one that is harmful, but no one in this debate can conclusively say that colonialism is innately evil. The ultimate question the op bench asks in this debate is whether the justification of colonial presence is one of a thought or one of a thought of crime. The first comparison I want to draw here is the legal precedents and the implications of the likes of war crime, and why legally the act of local justification of colonial presence is one that is unjustified as of now as op bench. What Andrews told you is that empirically, the scope of war crimes has been one that is by characterization punishes the initiation of violation of laws of war. This looks like Hitler's right and left-hand man being prosecuted for not for just explaining that Hitler's actions were correct, but for executing Hitler's orders to commit to atrocities. I think what Andrews conclusively draws out at this comparison is that war crimes, as per the current ambit, is one that punishes acts far more serious than making a random statement that hints towards the justification for colonial presence. CO takes a further step here to suggest that the burden that the government bench have to defend throughout the debate is, for one, to be incorporated with the category of war crime. It's one, not as O mentions, it's just unfair, but one, the standard that is uniquely high even by the status quo. What did government bench do to meet this high benchmark of war crime then? The second question here is on whether the action of justifying the presence of colonialism is one that constitutes war crime. OG's analysis is that the point in which you justify these is when you give legitimacy to these colonizers. I think this is a flawed analysis insofar as this is a leap from the publication. There is a leap from publication of these studies to the acceptance of its people. Insofar as it is contextually a post-colonial state that where ideas and spectrums does exist to a far extent, and fragmentation also perpetrated, also means that it's a high hurdle for government bench to prove that citizens will immediately accept the idea that colonialism is good. Particularly, the secondly analysis here to say that people in post-colonial state are often people who have first-hand or second-hand experience that has seen these atrocities of war and colonialism, and that the image is often visceral to them. I'm unsure how persuasive these justifications are to them. The third comparison we'll draw here is on why jurisprudentially incorporating the justification of colonial presence is not within the sphere of law of war. This is where Andrews' extension come in. The way in which CO enters here is to first explain the deontological angle for why this is unjust. Historically, people who colonize are people who utilize certain groups of other local demographics to control and contain the colonial state. Note, this is a nuance from openings analysis on why it's bad to just punish the colonizer. The way in which closing enters is that there is also this group of demographics who used to benefit historically under historically under colonialism by luck and by arbitrary factors that sees things differently through different lenses and therefore likely comes to different conclusions. I think this means that by deontology, it's principally unjust to ascribe liability to people who had no knowledge of the actions at the time of the crime other than the perpetrator, i.e. the colonizers. The second jurisprudential angle here is utility. This is often also why some elements that may be considered bad is not legally liable. There is often a policy reason on why this is far more likely to be the case, i.e. the labeling effect of making these people the enemy of humanity is the point in which you further destabilize post-colonial states when you encourage animosity and call-outs. I think all of these structural analysis, legal debate, is where legal debates also often take into consideration, especially if this debate happens contextually in post-colonial states where the priority is often on reconciliation as opposed to retaliation. The third consideration and reason to oppose this motion is that by deterrence, the role that government bench is essentially taking is the thought police, where you suppress thoughts that supposedly provoke discourses and debates like these is the point in which you also invade overtly into individual autonomy and people's ability to think. Note here, I think the key on the motion is the source of this supposed knowledge. As per the motion, people who publish such knowledge are people who are local intellectuals, not random CEOs as OG contends to be. I think this looks like what the info site suggests. Things like professors publishing in justifications means that these are actors who are also held up to other high standards than money, such as the aspiration to knowledge and professional ethics. The second observation I want to make here is on OG's analysis on why who these intellectuals are. Their one-liner analysis here is that these intellectuals are often bought off. I think this is a claim far bigger than they are proved. But more importantly, I just proved why this is also unlikely true. This is to say that these are also people where equally they have other incentives to drive their research. Even if these people are bought off, the fundamental question here I want to ask is, does the act of finding justification for colonial justification lead to one-sided additional harm from government, or that it leads to meaningful discourses? The deadlock here came across in the opening bench, where OG says, being able to prove this is the truth is where you give legitimacy for colonizers to exploit you. The outset of this argument begs the question of whether this one-time sporadic justification is the universal truth immediately. The first thing I want to point out here is the idea that justification of these presents is one that leads to economic exploitation and harm. The second thing I want to say here is that we don't have to prove that one side of this story eventually becomes the truth, because frankly, as O pointed out, these issues are often a complicated issue that requires far more introspection than 1 hour-long debate or one research to be able to back up. But the third thing I want to point out is Andrew's extension on how your research freedom is oppressed. The point in which you don't have people to overturn these papers is the point in which you no longer have discourses over what is the truth or what is the better outcome that we are trying to intend to be. This is to say that in a world where we do have research, for instance, and papers, I'm unsure why is this a unique version of truth that will be ascribed by people, but more importantly, I am pretty sure that likely there will be other versions of truth that will come out and overturn because it's fucking academia. The next thing I'll focus on is to take out government bench. CJ engaged in a causation analysis of how their actions are causative to the atrocities that they cause. The first thing I want to note here is that causation is part of the process of trial, i.e., just because you are causatively liable does not mean that you are overall liable for the actions that you opt to take. On the flip, I also think that causatively, for one to be found causative to be held liable is quite doubtful in such trials. If you test like the but-for test, there are many other reasons why people would have committed to atrocities regardless, as opposed to just the act of reading your justification and your version of truth. The second observation I want to make here is that CG's analysis is based on the idea that these acts did lead to an utilitarian outcome, i.e., the way in which CG justifies for an in-court offense that ultimately may not be the main cause of the intended outcome is to prove it using the assumption that these ideas did cause the atrocities. I think to the extent that we have proofs, why is it that people would not easily buy in and be persuaded? I'm unsure why is this anywhere impactful. I think that on this level, I think we take CG out because CG's extension is beyond the assumption that these people will eventually lead to the crimes. To the extent that we have already responded to the idea that people will not eventually or instinctively commit these crimes, I think that CG is therefore also out. I'm unsure why this is anyway impactful. The third thing I want to respond to here is just the idea of defense of crime, where people, for instance, have been granted exemptions in law, for instance. I think this is also why people like these also have to be debated, because I think that's why exemptions comes about.
Thank you for the very nice speech. With that, we can conclude the debate of this round. With that, I would request all of the speakers